This lecture is going to go over isotopes and ions. It is part 1. It's going to mostly focus on ions. We'll hit isotopes more in the second one, but we will see some introductory stuff on it in here. So we've already talked about protons and electrons, and protons are going to be what define our element. So if our proton number changes, then the element changes. So we know that we find the protons by the atomic number. So if the atomic number is 6, meaning there are 6 protons, then we have carbon. If that atomic number changes to 10, then we know that we have neon because we have 10 protons. So your atomic number, which matches with your protons, is always going to define your element. If the atomic number changes, then the element changes. So I'll write that here. You want to write that down. If atomic number changes, then the element changes. All right, so we have not talked about neutrons up to this point, except that they're found in the nucleus and they do not have a charge. If the number of neutrons changes, we have what we call an isotope, and that will be what we go over in the second video, but I just want to get all the details out first here. So that is when the number of neutrons changes, you are left with an isotope. So make sure that you're writing here that it's when the number of neutrons changes that you have an isotope. So with electrons, it's when the number of electrons changes. We have what we call an ion. So that's what the focus of this lecture is going to be. So an example of something where your neutrons change, this isotope, would be we might have oxygen that has 8 neutrons, and we might also have oxygen that has 9 neutrons. So those would be isotopes of oxygen. But then we could have oxygen with 8 electrons, but we could also have oxygen with 10 electrons. That 10 electrons is an ion because our electron number changed from what it originally was. So just a reminder, atomic number equals your protons and electrons in a neutral atom. So I used that term a lot when we first started talking, just so you were used to that your atomic number is going to be equal to your protons and your electrons if it is neutral, meaning there is no charge. Then we have that atomic mass, or the mass number, which is on the bottom if you're looking at a periodic table. And that is going to be the mass of one atom of an element. And that is going to be equal to the sum of your protons plus your neutrons. So the mass of your atom is going to come from the nucleus, your protons and your neutrons. Electrons have a very, very small mass in comparison, so even when we add up hundreds of electrons, it does not contribute to the overall mass because they are so small. So your atomic mass here is equal to your protons plus your neutrons. Now, if you look at a periodic table, your mass might be something like, for calcium, it's 40.01. So if it's protons plus neutrons, why do we have a decimal? Well, that's because your periodic table shows you the average atomic mass, which there's another lecture on this, but that is just the average of all isotopes. So there is going to be another lecture on this, on the average atomic mass. But just know that when you're looking at the periodic table, it's not going to help you determine the number of neutrons directly. Okay? So, as said before, this is going to focus on ions. So an ion is when your electron number changed. So what that means is your atom is going to have a charge. It's either going to have a positive charge or it's going to have a negative charge due to the gain or the loss of an electron. Okay, so now what you're going to have to remember a lot is that electrons have a negative charge. So if we gain a negative charge, you're going to have something become more negative. Okay, if you lose a negative charge, it's going to become more positive. Okay, so we're going to do some examples here, but just keep in mind that your electrons have a negative charge. So if we just have a carbon atom, it has no charge on it, let's determine the number of protons that we have, the number of electrons we have. You're looking at a periodic table, we find carbon, it's C. To find those protons, we look at our atomic number. The atomic number of carbon is 6, which means that we have 6 protons, and then since it's neutral, it has no charge, we also have 6 electrons. Okay, so that is what we have been doing already. You've already mastered that. You're pretty good with just looking at the periodic table for that. Now, if we have oxygen, but it has, we're going to write it like this, has a, do you see this -2 up here on a superscript? That tells you what the charge of the overall atom is. So our charge is -2. So to find our protons, we're always going to look at our periodic table. So we know that we have 8 protons. Now, if our overall charge is -2, that means that we have more negatives than we do positives because the overall charge is negative. And how many more? We have 2 more. So from my 8 protons, now I have 10 electrons. Because here's another way to think of this. If you're just doing this with math, this is +8 from the protons, and we're adding that to -10. When you add these two numbers together, you get -2, which is your overall charge right here. Okay? So this represents your overall charge. Now, what I see happen a lot is that since this is -2, we think, oh, we just subtract 2 electrons, but that comes back to remembering that electrons are negative. So here's another one for you, aluminum, and we have Al plus 3. So if we look at our periodic table, find those protons first. Protons come from the atomic number, so we're going to have 13 of them. Now we are plus 3, which means that we have 3 more positives than we do negatives. So if we have 3 more positives than negatives, that means that we have 10 electrons. So once again, if it helps you, add them up. +3 and -10 is going to give you +3. That should match this number right here. Okay? So you're going to see things referred to as cations and anions. A cation is just a positive ion, so one that has a positive charge, like that aluminum you just saw. An anion is one that has a negative charge, so that's like that oxygen that we did before that. So one way that I've always remembered this is when you think positive, I usually think a plus sign. Look at that T. That's your plus sign. Okay? So a positive ion is a cation. A negative is an anion. If you remember just the plus with the positive and that T, then you know the other one by default. All right. So what we're going to do here, I'm going to do an example for you, and then I'll give you a chance to do some on your own. If there is nothing up here, see how there's nothing here? That means that it is neutral. If there is something in your superscript, that is your charge. So what we're going to do here, we're going to look at a potassium neutral atom and a potassium ion. So my potassium neutral, my protons, I'm going to have, take a look at your periodic table, 19, which means that I'm going to have 19 electrons. So this is neutral. No charge up there. With my potassium ion, protons staying the same, going to be 19. So now my plus sign means that I have more positives than I do negatives. And how many more? If there's nothing there, that means 1. So you may see it written like this. The majority of the time, if you just see a plus sign or you just see a minus sign, it is 100% safe to say that is representative of 1 on your charge. So if it's just a plus or just a minus, it's the same thing as saying it's just +1, -1. So this is a +1 charge, which means that we have more positives. And how many more? 1 more, which means we have 18 electrons. So if this is a positive ion that comes from your charge here, that means that this is a cation. Okay? So here is one that I want you to go ahead and do on your own. So get it copied down, pause it, and then once you are finished, start it back up, and then we will go over the answer. All right, for nitrogen, looking at that periodic table, atomic number 7. Since it is neutral, there is no charge up here. Your electrons are also 7, so this is once again neutral. Nitrogen, since it's nitrogen, we know that our proton number is going to come from the periodic table, your atomic number. It's going to be 7. -3 means I have more negatives than I do positives. And how many more negatives do I have? 3 more. -10. So a negative ion is also an anion. Okay? Here's one more for you to try, so go ahead, pause this one, and we will get you, once you come back, we'll go over the answer. Neutral, no charge. We're going to have the same number come from your periodic table. Atomic number, still going to represent our protons here. Negative sign, remember that negative by itself means -1. That's telling me I have more negatives than I do positive. How many more? 1. -10. This one's neutral. This one is an anion. Okay, so go ahead, work on your practice problems. Make sure you're looking at the ones that say ions not isotopes. That is what I'm going to go over with you in the next lecture. So if you're looking to just work on things from this one, make sure you're looking at ions.